Hello everybody. We're still on Unit 1 for the course, which is the Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. So Roman number 1 was what is anatomy and physiology. We talked about anatomy relating to structure, physiology relating to function. Then we started to talk about the structural design of living things, starting with the cell as the basic building block of living things. I gave you some information about cells. Cells form tissues. A tissue is a group or cluster of similar cells. We place tissues into four main categories: epithelial tissue, which could also be called epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and neural tissue, neural or nervous tissue. I went through that very quickly. We'll have a whole unit on tissues, so we will be coming back to that. And then the next level of this structural design is the organ level, or organs. Now, this is a very simple level for us to think about, because whatever degree of sophistication we have about anatomy and physiology, for a very long time, all of us have been thinking about the body as a collection of organs. So even a child would talk about a stomach ache. People hear about heart attacks, liver disease. So we're talking about the body as a collection of organs, and it's easy for us to think about organs. Now, an organ is defined as a structure composed of more than one type of tissue. Things are falling down. I might try to edit that out of the video, but first I have to learn how to edit video, so I'm lying. I'm never going to edit that out of the video. An organ is a structure composed of more than one type of tissue. Now, there are some structures in the body that are made of only one type of tissue. You wouldn't call that an organ. In order for it to be an organ, it has to have more than one type of tissue. So the stomach's an organ, the heart's an organ, the liver's an organ, the small intestine is an organ. Even your thumb can be thought of as an organ. It's got skin, it's got muscle, I can feel it, it's got neural tissue. So your thumb is a structure, and it's composed of more than one type of tissue. Therefore, it satisfies the definition of an organ. There are certain terms that relate to organs that I want you to memorize. You may know some of them already, and they are the terms gastric, splenic, renal, cardiac, hepatic, pulmonary, cranial, and lumen. Gastric, splenic, renal, cardiac, hepatic, pulmonary, cranial, and lumen. The first of these, up through and including cranial, refer to a specific organ. So why don't you pause the video for a moment and see how many of these you already know what organ goes with these terms. And I'll give you that in a minute, but pause the video, see how many you can come up with. Lumen is a little different, and we'll come to that in a minute. So gastric is stomach. It refers to the stomach. Splenic refers to the spleen. Renal refers to the kidney or kidneys. This is a C, cardiac. My C's often look like L's, which is a nightmare. Cardiac, that's heart. Hepatic is liver. Pulmonary is lungs. And cranial would be brain. So make sure you know that. Now the lumen is the hollow part of an organ. So your lumen again is the hollow part of an organ. Your tongue is sitting in the lumen of your mouth. You've got blood flowing through the lumens. Lumen, what would be plural for lumen? I don't know. You've got blood flowing through the lumen of blood vessels. If this eyeglass case represents a stomach, it's hollow. The food would be in the hollow part. That would be the lumen of the stomach. So make sure you know all these terms and the term lumen. Again, an organ is a structure composed of more than one type of tissue, and organs have specific functions. So I use the eyeglass case to represent the stomach, and we know the stomach's an organ. So if the stomach is an organ, it must be made out of more than one type of tissue. Now, if you've already learned the information given in the earlier lecture, there's no need to review it. But before I go through the stomach as an example of an organ, you might want to take a quick minute to review your notes. By the way, I don't think I've said this yet. I'm giving these lectures the same as if we were in class together. The only difference is that when I give these lectures in class, I ask questions as I go along, and I try to get students to participate and answer the questions. Well, I'm even asking questions during these videos, only I'm not expecting to hear your answers because you're not here right now. So it's very similar to what I would do in a class. And in a class, you would be taking notes. So you should treat this like you're sitting in a room and take notes expanding on just what I'm putting on the board. You should have a complete set of notes. So, if this represents a stomach, what type of tissue would you expect to form the covering of the stomach? Now, if you understand the information in the last video, you know the answer to that question. And the answer is it's epithelial tissue, or at least you'd expect it to be epithelial tissue. Why would you expect it to be epithelial tissue? Because you've learned, or at least you ought to have learned, that epithelial tissue lines and covers. So it covers in the case of the stomach. If we open up the stomach and we see it has a lining, if I were to say, what type of tissue would you expect to form the lining? Again, you'd expect it to be epithelial tissue. Now, there might be exceptions where in certain structures, like bones, for instance, bones are hollow. They have marrow in the hollow, we call it the marrow cavity. And the marrow cavity of a bone does have a lining. But it happens to be the case that that's an exception, and the lining of the marrow cavity of the bone is not made out of epithelial tissue. But in the stomach, it's epithelial tissue. Now, the stomach moves and churns the food, mixes the food with digestive juices. Eventually, it squeezes and pushes the food into the small intestine. So what type of tissue is required for movement? Hopefully, you already know it's muscle tissue. More specifically, in the case of the wall of the stomach, you've got smooth muscle. Now, there are also glands, and I may not have mentioned this in the previous video, but epithelial tissue, it doesn't only cover and line, it also forms glands. So if I did not mention that in the earlier video, add that to your understanding about epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue lines, covers, and forms glands. So there are glands in the wall of the stomach that secrete hydrochloric acid, that secrete digestive enzymes, that secrete water, mucus, a mixture of substances called gastric juice, and we've learned gastric means stomach. So these glands secrete gastric juice into the lumen of the stomach, and that digests your food. Those gastric juices digest your food. So I just gave you the answer to this question. What kind of tissue would you expect to be forming glands? And the answer is epithelial tissue. So when you've eaten, you've got the muscles churning, squeezing the food, mixing it with the digestive juices, and you've got the glands secreting the digestive juices into the lumen of the stomach. You don't want to secrete digestive juices into the lumen of your stomach except when you've eaten food, because those, if you killed an animal and removed the stomach and you cooked up the stomach, which I believe is called tripe, T-R-I-P-E, you could eat the stomach of an animal and you would digest it, but you don't digest your own stomach. Although in certain times you begin to make little lesions, little damaged areas in the lining of the stomach. We actually are beginning to digest a little bit of the lining of the stomach. Those are called ulcers. So that can't happen. But generally speaking, we're not digesting our own stomach, and part of the way that we make sure that we don't digest our own stomach is by controlling the secretion so that we only secrete the digestive juices when we're eating food. Now, if you bring your attention to your mouth, you'll notice some saliva in your mouth, even if you're not eating. If I ask you to think about and picture your favorite food, what do you feel happening in your mouth? You feel yourself salivating more, which is telling you that you're controlling the secretion of saliva in your mouth. And when you think about eating, you start secreting more saliva. When you're eating or even thinking about eating, your stomach would be secreting more gastric juice. So what I'm telling you is we control the secretion of the enzymes and other materials in the digestive system, and we control the movement. We don't need a lot of movement if there's no food in the stomach. So what kind of tissue would be coming into the stomach to control the secretion and the movement? And again, if you're keeping up with the course, you know the answer to that question, which would be neural or nervous tissue. Now, if you looked at an actual stomach, you'd see blood vessels running through the wall of the stomach with blood to supply oxygen and nutrients to the wall of the stomach, which the cells that make up the wall of the stomach, they need oxygen and nutrients to stay alive. So we have blood vessels coming into the wall of the stomach to supply the oxygen and the nutrients. And what kind of tissue is blood? Do you know? It's connective tissue. So the stomach is a nice example of an organ because it's actually got all four kinds of tissue. It's got epithelial tissue covering it, lining it, forming glands. It's got smooth muscle tissue. It's got neural tissue to control everything. And it's got connective tissue in the form of blood. And there's other aspects of connective tissue. We're not going to go into that much detail. So the stomach is an organ. It's actually got all four types of tissue. An organ wouldn't have to have all four types of tissue. It would just have to have more than one type of tissue. So that's organs. That's the organ level. Now, the next level of the structural design is the organ system. I often get lazy and just say system, but the full term would be organ system, like the digestive system, the respiratory system, etc. We're going to talk about 11 systems. See you soon.